Hi everyone, welcome back to the Beginner Livestock series presented by Orange, Sullivan, and Ulster counties. This week we're going to be talking about the introduction to raising beef cattle. And just as a reminder, please make sure that you stay muted during the presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat and then we can answer those questions and have some discussion at the end. Of course, this is being presented by Michelle, Steph, and I. Today I will be the one talking about beef cattle. And just as a reminder, this is an 8-part series. So if you're just now joining us, we can also provide the recordings to the past webinars for you. And your one registration and the one Zoom link will be used for all of our other presentations down the line. So to start off, I'm going to go through the general production cycle of beef cattle. So it starts off with a cow-calf operation, and these kind of operations are what is predominant in the East Coast. It is where these, the purpose of these cows is to produce the calves that will go on to either stay in the herd or will go on to be part of the food system. So with these cow-calf operations, calves are then weaned at about 6 to 8 months of age. So that means they're separated from their mothers, and a lot of times they will go to what's called a stocker operation. And so the stocker operation's purpose is to put more weight on these calves, let them grow very cheaply. So these are predominantly pasture-based systems. These calves mostly stay on grass, maybe getting a little bit of grain, but pasture is much cheaper than buying a lot of feed. So they're still a forage-based system, just like the cow-calf operation. And in some cases, maybe those cow-calf producers will also do that phase themselves. Maybe they'll keep those calves with them for a little longer, a couple more months, before then they will be sold or taken to a feedlot. So in the feedlot, obviously, is where it's a more grain or concentrate-based diet, but they still have a very forage-based diet as well. A lot of them are fed corn silage, which is where the whole corn stalk is essentially chopped up and put in a silo or an ag bag or something like that, and to be fermented a little bit to kind of break down some of those tough starches. But it is still very much forage based, which is good for their digestive systems, which we'll get into a little bit more later. And so they're generally in the feedlots for a couple months as well. Usually about 12 to 18 months of age, when those animals will be about 1,200 to 1,400 pounds. That's when they then go on to being harvested and becoming food to, go either stay locally or go all over the country. And of course, throughout this phase with beef cattle, there's a lot of flexibility in the system. So cow-calf producers might sell those calves to a stocker operation, or they might sell directly to the feedlot, or they could even raise them and get them processed themselves as well. And then, of course, to maintain the cow herd, we do have the replacement heifers. And so replacement heifers are, as the name would suggest, females that are kept on the farm to replace the cow herd, the cows that are getting older, cows that maybe are sold, cows that are not being productive, and kind of continue on with that herd. And so even though predominantly the diagram I just showed is the way that most of the beef is produced in this country, but commercially, what you're going to find in the grocery store. But there's also a growing movement for people wanting local foods. I'm also looking for more niche markets. So there's a lot of different kind of branding going on, whether it's USDA organic, grass-fed, or grain-fed beef. If marketing towards people of either Jewish or Muslim or Islamic religions, so with the kosher and halal. And then also, as you can see, locally grown is also really a growing movement as well. The New York State has a grown and certified certification that producers can apply to of all commodities, not just beef cattle, but a lot of other animal products, as well as vegetables and fruit and things like that. I also would like to draw your attention to the Meat Suite website. So that's a website designed to connect consumers with locally raised meats. So farms can have profiles on that, as well as, so then consumers can go on and look within, a certain number of mile radius of where they live, and they can look for different products, as well as being able to sort out for priorities that they might have, whether they want grass-fed or organic beef or grain-fed, meat, and things like that. So these kind of, with the beef industry, as I said, it's very flexible. There's a lot of room for people doing different things. And so a lot of these really help with that. So I'm not going to go a ton into detail about space and infrastructure requirements, just because we covered that in our first session with the intro to livestock. But just as a reminder that generally the rule of thumb is to have 1 animal unit per acre, and 1 animal unit being 1,000 pounds of animal. So this generally means that you can have a cow-calf pair on about 1.5 to 2 acres. And of course, this can be more efficient if you have more intensive grazing management, but as a general rule, you probably don't want to get have too many more animals than a 1 pair per acre and a half to 2 acres. And then with shelter, ideally you have 50 square feet per animal unit, as well as having 2 to 2.5 feet of feed trough space per animal, so that they all have room to be at the feed trough at the same time, so you're not getting a lot of fighting and things like that. And of course, cattle are large animals, so you really need to have good fencing, and all animals really have to have a clean water available to them at all times. So then to start off by talking a little bit about cattle behavior, and there's a couple really key concepts to keep in mind when moving or handling cattle. So this circle right here is called the flight zone. And what that is how close you can get to the animal before they want to move away from you, because you're kind of getting into their space bubble there. With some cattle that are used to being handled, or maybe that have been shown at fairs and things like that, you might be able to go right up to them, and touch them before they want to move away from you, and maybe they don't even want to move away, which can present other problems as well. And then there's some cattle where the second you step into the field, they're already trying to go all the way to the other end and get away from you. But you want to use that to your advantage to moving these cattle calmly based on how you position yourself with that. Another concept to keep in mind is this line right here, which is the point of balance, which is right at the point of their shoulder. And so what that is the line of where you are on either side of that line. The cattle are going to move away from you in a certain direction. So if you are behind the line, they're going to want to move forward. If you're in front of the line, they're going to want to turn and move away from you. So you always want to keep that your positioning in mind when you're trying to move cattle. Sorry about that. So when you are here, this diagram is kind of where you want to be standing when you want the cow to move. Since you're behind the point of balance here, if you step into the flight zone, they're going to move forward. And if you stop moving or step behind, then they're going to be back. Additionally, cattle can see almost 360 degrees, but they do have a blind spot right behind them. So you always want to be careful to not walk up to them directly behind them, because if they can't see you, then they're more likely to be startled, and then you're more likely to be potentially kicked by those animals. They also technically have a blind spot right in front of their forehead, but that's just for kind of smaller objects. If you're holding something in front of their face, they might not be able to see it, but if you're standing in front of them, they're going to be able to see you. And then for safety reasons, here is the kick zone of cattle. People that have maybe have experience with horses might expect cattle to only be able to kick right behind them, and that is not the case. Cattle can kick all the way around this area. And so if you're near them and close enough within range, you really want to be careful. You either want to be outside the range, or if you have to be close to the cattle, you want to be close enough where they can't get a lot of momentum in their leg to do that. Then some other behaviors of cattle that people who design facilities have tried to take advantage of to design to make things less stressful for the cattle is the fact that they like to follow other cattle. They're herd animals, so they like to stay together, and they also like these circular pens because they feel like they're going back to where they were before. So if you're walking the cattle, they're kind of going to circle around you and go back to where they were. And this is trying to mimic that with these facilities. But of course, not everyone has the space or the money to be able to design big facilities like that. And there's also simpler ways that you can use these behaviors, such as this thing called the bud box, where you just have where you're trying to get the cow to go here, and then they just have this dead end here, and then the person is the X shutting the gate, and then moving around the cow. So then they're still like using that curve, and they're going where you want them to go. So as I mentioned before, but I'm really going to reiterate because this is a really important, having a space where you can safely handle and restrain cattle is so important because they are very large animals. And even if they are really calm most of the time, if you're trying to give them a medicine or give them a vaccination or need to check them out, it's really important to have a way to restrain them. So, they can't just throw their head and, knock you over and things like that. So there's a lot of different chute systems that kind of have this basic framework of having a head chute or head gate here to restrain the neck, having a way to squeeze it down just so the animal doesn't have too much room to thrash. So you can fit different size animals in and then squeeze it down to be flush with the actual animal, be able to restrain them better. And there's a lot of different ways that these can be designed. So this is just one example. There's also a possibility of if you don't want to like pay for a whole chute system, maybe you only have a couple animals, it's not as much worth the expense. And you can just get the head gate itself and set it up with different panels that you might already have. So then you still have a way to restrain the head and be able to administer medications or vaccinations or things like that. And then some of the newer, more expensive chutes also have this kind of head catch here. And so if you, to keep the head stable, if you have to do anything around the head or neck, or just another way to keep them more still, you could also use a halter and maybe try to, like if you have this chute, you could use a halter to tie it somewhere to move their head to the side if you need to get to their neck or restrain them more. So then to get into talking about some of the major breeds, there are a couple different distinct kind of groupings of different breeds of cattle. Here we have the Angus that I'm sure everybody has heard of, and we have Herefords and we have Shorthorns. And these three are the main three British breeds. And so that means that they, as you would expect, originated from Britain. And then we have these breeds called the continental breeds. So they originated in continental Europe. So we have Charolais, Simmental, Limousin, and Gelbvieh. And the reason that these are kind of considered separately is they have a lot of, they have differing characteristics from each other. So the British breeds generally are thought of as more maternal cattle. They have faster growing calves. They have a smaller mature weight, so it takes them less time to get there. And they also tend to have more marbling in the meat, which is those flecks of fat within the actual meat that gives a lot of juiciness and flavor. But that means they also have more external fat kind of like around their bodies. Whereas continental cattle do have larger mature weights, so that it takes them longer to get there. They're a little slower growing, but they're generally leaner and they have a better yield of product because they don't have as much of that external fat that you kind of have to trim off. And then we also have the Bos indicus cattle, which is kind of a subtype of the species. And these originated in India. The Brahmin is the Brahmin breed, which comes from the Zebu cattle of India. And one of the advantages of the Bos indicus type cattle is that they are very tolerant of the heat and they're really resistant to parasites and other pests. They really deal with those well. And so we're not going to see these around here in New York, but these are really prevalent in the South and the Southeast, such as like Florida and Texas, the Gulf Coast, places like that, because they really need animals that can withstand the heat. And so from the Brahmin, there's been a lot of different separate breeds created through crossing with Brahmins, like the standard Gertrudis, the Brangus, which, as you would expect, is the cross between a Brahmin and an Angus, to basically get some of the advantages of Angus while still being heat tolerant and things like that, as well as the Beefmaster breed. And this is just, talking about these breeds is just really looking at the main ones. There are tons and tons of different breeds that also that you can consider if you're looking at maybe getting a more niche breed or something like that. There's a lot of different options there as well. But of course, you don't need to stick with just purebred cattle. In fact, a lot of the cattle in the US that go to feedlots and stuff are crossbred. And the reason this is because if you, for example, are taking the crossing British breeds and continental breeds, you have hybrid vigor, so you're getting kind of the best of both of those sectors. And so hybrid vigor, if you remember way back in high school biology class, is just where there is the performance of the offspring of a crossbreeding performs better than the average of its parents. So what you would expect, if you just average the parents, they perform better than that. And that's something that is really good to target in the commercial beef industry. But even within, if you have purebred or your crossbreds, you still might have different goals for your operation and want to improve through genetic selection. The beef industry uses what's called expected progeny differences, and actually a lot of different livestock species use these as well. So what these are is looking at production data from offspring of like bulls or cows or their actual production data, as well as now with better technology, we can also take samples for genetic testing and integrate those numbers as well. But they have these are just kind of the tip of the iceberg for the different categories of numbers. We have these separated into different facets for selection because everyone has different goals. So we have kind of calving ease and birth weight, meaning you want a lower birth weight to make it easier for the cows to give birth. You don't have to assist as much, you cause less problems. Growth traits such as weaning weight and yearling weight here because you want fast growing calves. And then maternal traits, so talking about milk production, maternal calving ease, maternal weaning weight, so how the daughters of that bull and that cow can be expected to perform as compared to the daughters of another animal. So these aren't hard and fast numbers of what they will do, but this is the average of what they're expected to do compared to the offspring of another animal. And here we also have scrotal circumference, which is an indicator of fertility. We're looking at bulls and their as well as their sons and daughters. And then we also have carcass traits here. So ribeye area, back fat, and then marbling. So depending on what your goals are, what stage of production that you're selling animals, or if you're retailing meat yourself, it's going to make your priorities and what you're kind of trying to choose on differently. And then there are also, in some breeds, they do have index values as well that combines different traits into, like several different traits into one number to make selection a little bit easier. So now getting into the actual how the cow works, it's really important before we talk about nutrition to talk about the digestive system, because ruminants are very different from other animals. And so it's really important to take how their system works into account when we're thinking about what we should be feeding them. So here we have it's one stomach, but it's 4 different compartments: the rumen, reticulum, omasum, and abomasum. And the biggest thing that's different from other animals is this rumen right here. So the rumen is where there's a lot of microbes in there that are fermenting the feed. And so cattle they don't bite their food and they don't chew it when they first eat it. They use their tongues to wrap their tongues around because they don't have top teeth in the front, so they can't actually physically bite the feed. And so they swallow it. And then once they're done grazing, they'll go like lay down or stand in the shade or something like that. And then they will be bringing that feed back up to chew because they do have top teeth in the back with their molars, and they're swallowing. This constant process of breaking it down, coating it with saliva to like keep the rumen pH good. And then all these microbes are doing a lot of this digestion. And so the main way that cattle get energy is because all these microbes are producing volatile fatty acids. And those are absorbed through the rumen wall into the bloodstream and then going on to provide energy to all these different places and be metabolized. And then the microbes are also producing protein as well. And so that will move on through the system of their stomachs to be digested as well. So the protein that cattle eat mostly isn't the protein that they're getting. The microbes are eating that protein, and then the cattle are getting the microbial protein. So you can see the linings of the different stomachs. Here in the rumen, there's all these protrusions called papillae, which is where the volatile fatty acids are absorbed. And so there's a lot of surface area here. The reticulum then is kind of where, as the feed particles get smaller and smaller, they kind of collect here and then get moved to the omasum, which is where a lot of water is absorbed through all these folds to retain, get back some of the water in there. And then it moves to the abomasum, which is sometimes called the true stomach, which is the stomach that's most like ours. It's got hydrochloric acid. It's a lot of digestive enzymes breaking down that food before it then moves to the small intestine. And so in mature cows, the rumen takes up about 75% of the stomach capacity, and it can hold up to 40 gallons. But calves don't have all this development yet, so when they're nursing and drinking milk, a muscular fold comes through called the esophageal groove, and then the milk will just bypass all of the system to go straight to the omasum and abomasum, because that doesn't need to be fermented or anything like that. So of course, because that's the way the digestive system of the cattle works, forages should absolutely be the base at all stages of production, and that's why it is. So even in the feedlots, what people think of as, oh, they're just eating a lot of corn, but it's really still, since corn silage is very forage based. So cattle need 1 to 3% of their body weight in dry matter every day. Dry matter being feed with the removal of water. So when we think about how much they're eating, it's not pounds of feed that they've eaten. It's if you took all the water out, how many pounds would they have consumed of dry matter, because that's where all the nutrients are. And so many factors affect this, such as their stage of production. A cow that's producing milk to feed her calf is going to need a lot more energy and protein than a cow that's just, she's weaned her calf and she's just pregnant and she's, hanging out waiting until it's time to deliver her next calf. Of course, body size affects this. Weather, so in the wintertime, cows are going to eat more because they're going to need more energy to keep their body temperatures up, as well as when their body condition also will affect this as well. Interestingly, when cattle will actually eat more of a higher quality feed than a lower quality feed, even though nutritionally they don't need as much of it, because lower quality feeds generally have more fiber, and so this fiber then fills up their gut, and it is a slower rate of digestion, so they won't be able to eat as much of it. So you definitely want to make sure that, as we've said before in our as Steph mentioned in the forages, you want to make sure that you're testing all your forages so you know the quality, you know if it's meeting their needs or not. And so if you find that the forages might not be meeting their needs, then you might be able to supplement with grain for either protein or if they need more energy, maybe for lactating cows. But you want to be careful, of course, because too much grain can throw the pH balance in their stomach out of whack, and that would be really bad for the microbes if it was too acidic. Additionally, for calves, that it might be a good idea because they need a little bit higher protein because they're growing, and also just to get them used to consuming grain that they might be eating later on. Some producers like to do these creep feeding, where you can see these slots that only the calves can get through and the cow cannot. So the cows can't be eating all their grain and they can get a little bit of extra there. But one of the cool things about livestock in general that I think is that when you're trying to feed them grain, it's a lot of times livestock can eat byproduct feeds. So that means they're feeds that would be considered waste products in other industries, such as distiller's grain, which comes from making ethanol, brewer's grain from making beer, soybean meal from making vegetable oil. And the cattle can take what would be a waste product to that industry and use it, and they can eat it as like a protein supplement or energy and things like that. So it's improving the sustainability of the system and making everything more sustainable. And then, of course, if your cattle are on pasture and they're not getting like a complete feed mix, it's definitely always a good idea to have a mineral supplement. If they're getting them more grain, maybe minerals are mixed in, but you definitely want to make sure you read the feed tags to make sure because these are the macro minerals that cows need in the greatest quantities, and then micro minerals that they need in smaller quantities, but they still need to make sure that they are getting enough. And so you can feed these in free choice. If it's mixed into, if you're feeding a protein or energy supplement, you can mix it into that. A lot of people, if they're not supplementing feed, they will still have these minerals out in a feeder, just free choice as like a loose mineral, or you might have seen mineral blocks in like Tractor Supply or something like that. And another note that you definitely want to make sure when you're putting cows out on really lush pastures in the spring, you want to make sure that they have a high magnesium mineral, because cows on really lush pastures early in the year can be really susceptible to magnesium deficiency, especially if they're lactating. And that can be really a thing that suddenly is onset and can kill them. So you want to make sure that you're avoiding those kind of problems. And then just as a brief review of some different grazing management strategies, because as we mentioned before in the forages talk, and also when we talk about the intro to livestock in general, you don't want to just have grazing animals just out in the same pasture all the time, because it's not good for the pasture health. You're going to get a lot more weeds. So you want to, and it's also not good for the soil. So you want to make sure you're utilizing these rotational grazing strategies, where you're moving them pastures and letting each pasture rest in between, or using strip grazing, where you can either just allow them a new section every time, and whether or not you fence them out of the other sections, it's still better than just letting them in the same area all the time. And here's just a visual of kind of why that's really important. So when the plant is grazed, it doesn't have these leaves to be able to do more growth. So they're pulling energy stores from the roots, and as they're growing back, the roots haven't grown back if it hasn't had enough time to rest. And so you really need to let that pasture rest even longer. And here's another visual. You can see that the more often that these are cut or what will be grazed, the less root structure. And so that's, the plant is more susceptible to the environmental stresses, and they're not as hardy as plants that have a lot of roots to be able to, there's a little bit of drought, these plants are really going to die, or they're going to be trampled maybe more and not be able to bounce back. And that would be really problems for your pasture health. So then going back to looking at the cows themselves, one way to monitor whether your cow's nutritional needs are being met, as well as to just monitor where you might have other problems, is called body condition scoring. And so body condition scores essentially are looking at the amount of fat cover that these animals have. And these are mainly for mature cows. You're not going to want to use this as much on growing calves, because it's just not going to tell you as much, because they're growing taller and putting more muscle on. They're not at really the stable place that mature cows are on. But the ideal here is the 5 and 6 range. And what you're going to be looking, where you're going to be looking on the cow to do this is in the brisket area. You're going to look over the back, over the ribs. Here's the hip bones, which is also called the hooks, and the pin bones, as well as the tail head. So you're looking at the amount of fat and the differences here. So the ideal range is 5 to 6, but 4 and 7 are also acceptable. And of course, this is really going to fluctuate based on the production cycle. So a cow that's weaning a calf can be expected to be closer to a 4 than a 7, because she's been using a lot of her energy and her body stores to be able to produce milk for that calf. And of course, it's pretty obvious why these emaciated ones are, why that's not good, because they're not, from a production standpoint, they're not going to be producing like they should. And also just from an animal welfare standpoint, this is not okay. And you can tell that when they get to these stages, it's not just fat that their body's breaking down, they're also breaking down muscle to be able to try and keep the body going. But on the other hand, you also don't want cows that are 8s and 9s, because those can also pose different health problems. They can also have problems calving if they see a lot of fat kind of in here, maybe around their reproductive organs. It could be hard on them when they go to give birth. But also, if you're feeding cows that are 8 and 9, then you're really wasting money because they're getting too much energy they don't need. So you can definitely cut them back if you're supplementing them, or maybe find a lower quality forage that can eat that for them to get them more into this acceptable range. And this is mainly just for reference later, but here it has more specific description of the different scores. Of course, they're all really subjective because different people kind of see different things and have different priorities. So what I might call a 6, someone else might call a 5, or a third person might call a 7. So it's not so much about getting the exact number right, but more about recognizing what the acceptable range is. So then to switch gears and talk about reproduction, as we've mentioned that the cow-calf sector, the goal is for every cow to have a calf every year. Which means that, of course, she has to get pregnant every year. And there's a couple of different ways that that can be done. In the beef industry, predominantly, it's done by keeping bulls with the herd. And this is much less labor intensive, which is kind of why it is predominantly. In the dairy industry, they use a lot more artificial insemination, but they have the cows, in the barn getting milked every day, twice a day. And it's really easy to just get them through a chute, like afterwards, to get them bred or things like that and check on them. But with beef cattle, it's not really, you're only bringing them in when you need to, or maybe if you're feeding every day, but you're not running them through a working facility a lot. So it is much less labor intensive to keep a bull, but you also do have to think of some other factors, like feed costs. So you have another animal that if you're supplementing or if you need hay during the winter time, then you need to think about that too. And it's always good for bulls to have a breeding soundness exam, which is where the veterinarian does it and they're evaluating his ability to get cows pregnant. So they look at a lot of physical factors such as, is he even just simple, like, is he able to walk okay? Is he lame? As well as looking at semen quality, if the sperm are going to be able to get to the egg to fertilize it. Additionally, with bulls, you have to think about safety. Bulls can be aggressive, so you want to make sure that you always are aware if there's a bull in the field that you're aware of where that could be an issue. And then generally, you want to keep a short breeding season, so then you also have to find somewhere to keep the bull for the whole rest of the year. And that's going to take feed and labor to be able to take care of him. And then artificial insemination, there are also other things to think about, such as storage. So generally for cattle, semen is kept frozen in liquid nitrogen. So you would have to have a tank, you'd have to know where the services that you're buying it from, as well as knowing the technique. And a lot of times semen companies will have technicians that can do this for you, but then, that is another factor you have to get them in and schedule and things like that. So here's a diagram of the technique that needs to be done to do artificial insemination. So you're going to be reaching one hand into the rectum and then being able to hold onto the cervix while you pass the insemination rod through that. And then you're going to then depositing the semen in the uterus. And so, of course, because you have to be getting the cows up, you have to have proper handling facilities to be able to do that. And then you also have to be monitoring the cattle for the proper time to breed, or working them through the chutes again to be able to do synchronization protocols. So then they're ready to breed on your time frame, not so much theirs. But either way, this does require more labor as well. So here's just a basic diagram of kind of hormones during the estrous cycle, which would be analogous to the menstrual cycle in humans. So for cattle, it averages about every 21 days. And then the time that when you're really going to want to pay attention to for breeding is called estrous. Notice the different spelling of the two words because they are different words. And it's also called standing heat or coming into heat. And so this is a period of when they're receptive to being bred, and it occurs before ovulation. And so some signs that they're getting to that point are if the cow's really restless, if they're trying to mount other cows, or the biggest one that shows that they are in estrus currently and they're ready to be bred is that if other cows are mounting them and they're standing for that and they're not trying to move away. Which of course would be, if you have a bull, that's when the bull would be breeding the cows. If you're doing artificial insemination, then you're going to go by the AM/PM rule, which means that If you see them in heat in the morning, you're going to breed them that evening, and vice versa. If you see them in heat in the evening, you're going to breed them next morning. And the reason that we do it like this is because if a bull is breeding them, then he's depositing that sperm into the vagina. It has to make its way through the cervix into the uterus. But with AI, you're bypassing that and putting it directly into the uterus. So you want to wait a little longer to increase the odds that it will get to the egg to fertilize it at the right time. So of course, you don't want to be spending all day, every day during the breeding season out there watching cows and seeing when they're coming to heat. So there are different tools we can use to help us monitor without having to actually be around them all the time. So here you can see this animal has tail chalk or tail paint on, and you put that on, and then when it's rubbed off, you know that other cows have been mounting her and that she is in heat. And the same principle with this, it's kind of like a scratch off here. So the more animals that are trying to mount, the more scratched off it will be. And so when it's at this point, you know that you need to be breeding that animal. So to determine when you want to be breeding the animals, you also need to think about when you want them to be giving birth. So there's different ways that people like to do it in different seasons, spring versus fall versus doing it in the winter. And there are a lot of these different factors that you want to take into account when determining what's going to work best for you and your operation. Because as I mentioned earlier, the beef industry is, really flexible with how people can do things. So some factors to keep in mind in the spring, sometimes it can still be, spring is generally from March to May calving, fall is usually September to November, and then winter or early calving would be like in the January, February range. Those are just the most typical. You can obviously, if you want to have cows calving in the summer, that is totally up to you, but just these are more typical to do. So in the spring, if it's like early, it might still be a little chilly, might be kind of muddy, so which can be hard on calves that are just born. There also might not be, the cows won't be on pasture quite yet, maybe. And so you have to be thinking about if you're still feeding hay, and then also, but in that case, then the grass will be growing over the summertime. And so when those calves are growing to weaning, there are plenty of forage resources available. But then also you will be trying to breed those cows back. Since gestation is about 9 months or 9.5 months, you're going to be trying to breed them back to calve again, and you're going to be breeding them in the hottest part of the summer. And so since heat stress affects all body systems, it is harder for cows to get bred during the summertime. On the flip side of that, in the fall, so you will have good weather when calves are being born, but you then, as they get bigger, it's getting colder, and you're going to have to start feeding hay. So then you're trying to take care of feed lactating cows and their calves through the winter time, which can be hard and uses definitely more resources than just trying to raise pregnant cows during that time. But then also you are breeding those cows in cooler temperatures. And of course, if you're doing early calving, as you would expect, you really need to have a place that's more enclosed, like a barn or something, to have cows calving. So it's not out in the snow and the mud, and give those calves, time to dry off in a warmer, dry environment. And so, of course, market prices definitely can be a factor, as well as the others. According to the USDA survey from 2015 2017, about 73% of all of the calves in the US were born in the springtime. And so because there is so much more supply of these calves that are born in the spring being weaned in the fall and ready to be sold through the markets, the prices generally are lower in the fall than they are in the spring, as you can see by this map from 2011 to 17. There are obviously some fluctuations like here. There are a lot of factors, so that cattle inventory was much lower, one of those being like a really bad blizzard in South Dakota that really reduced the cow herd. But even within that, it's still a little bit, like in the spring it's higher, and then it's like dipping down again in the fall. So if, of course, you take that into account, but also if spring calving is when it's going to work better for you, then maybe the market price doesn't bother you as much. But there's a lot of different factors, and everyone kind of assess their own priorities there as well. But regardless of what season of the year that you're calving in, you really want to make sure that you have a defined calving season. Generally, you want to aim for about 60 days. And the reason this is because, as you can see in the timeline, here is when the cows are pregnant. Here's when they are calving. So if you have a 60-day window here, and then you have a little time before you start the breeding season. And so that allows the cows, their bodies to recover, the reproductive system to recover, and then to, not be right in the first of their lactation where a lot of energy is going to making milk. But as you get later in the breeding season, or later in the calving season, it's, going out to 90 days now, you're kind of trying to overlap. And then at 120 days, at least half the breeding season, you still have cows calving. And so those cows are not likely to get bred back during that time. And so this number, I think, is a few years old. So I'm not sure what right now would be, but having this longer calving season does cost money in terms of how the pounds of weaned calf or how many weaned calves that you're able to sell. So you want to keep it to 60 days, which means that if you're using a bull, he's out there with the cows for 60 days and not any longer than that. If you're doing AI, obviously you have control about when you're doing that as well. So then to talk about kind of the stages of calving, kind of what you want to be looking for and what's normal for cattle. Usually all three of these stages last about 8 hours or less if everything is going correctly. So in the first days, that's when the cervix is dilating and they're starting contractions. Usually that takes about 2 to 6 hours. The cows are really restless. They're kind of getting up and laying down. And then at the end of this phase, that's when you will see the amniotic sac, or what's called the water bag, will come out as well. So then in delivery phase, that should last no more than 30 minutes to an hour. So this is the cow is having strong contractions. The calf is entering the birth canal. And here's the typical presentation here, where the front feet are first, with the head between the legs there. This also can be normal, where it's back legs first, but that's not ideal. And then if you have twins, this is kind of how they will be fitting in there. And so if this phase is taking longer than an hour, then you definitely need to either check the cow yourself, or if you're not comfortable doing that, you need to talk to a vet, because this means that probably the calf is either possibly too big, or it is in one of these abnormal presentations, and the cow's not going to be able to just push it out by itself, and it's going to need help to kind of rearrange that calf, such as like pulling the head forward, pulling the legs forward, and things like that. And then the final phase will be where the placenta is not ejected from the body, but when the placenta comes out, so the uterus will still be contracting even after the calf is born. Usually within 3 to 8 hours, then the placenta will come out. If it is not yet, you definitely do not want to pull it, because that can cause some damage internally for the cow. But you should definitely talk to your vet, figure out what they want to do, because she might need antibiotics to prevent any infection. And this eventually it will come out on its own, but you want to make sure that you're getting antibiotics to prevent the cattle from getting infected because of this being retained, which is what it's called. So when the calf is born, within the first couple of days, you really want to make sure that you have identification on the calf, whether that's an ear tag or a tattoo in the ear, or something like that. So then you, since when they're younger, they're a lot easier. They usually like laying down somewhere. You can usually get all these things done really quick, or if you bring them into a barn, get all these things done before they go out. You also want to dip their navels in a 7% iodine solution, just to prevent any bacteria from going in through where the umbilical cord was attached. If you have males, unless you're planning on keeping them as bulls, which unless you're like a purebred breeder, you probably aren't going to be doing that. You want to make sure you castrate them then, because it's a lot easier and less stressful on the animals. And this can be done either by surgically cutting them out, or by putting a band around the scrotum above the testicles to be able to, and then eventually that tissue would just atrophy and come off. And then in some cases, people also want to give like a nasal vaccine to protect the calf against any kind of respiratory problems as well. And then once you get to that 6 to 8 months of age time, that's when generally weaning occurs. And so weaning is a very stressful time in a calf's life. So traditionally, and what happened has been in a lot of places, is that the cattle will, they'll be separated from their mothers, and then they will hop onto a trailer and it will be sent off to auction right then, where then once they get to another operation, they might be vaccinated and a lot of different things all at one time, which is super stressful for the animal, and it will negatively impact their growth and their health as well. So more recently, some other strategies were developed, such as fence line weaning or using these nose clips like you can see here. So the purpose of this is these calves are still able to see their mothers, and they're still able to have some kind of physical contact or hear them, but they're not able to nurse. And so the weaning process happens because they're not able to nurse, but it's less stressful because they can still see other mothers through the fence, or they're still in the same pasture because this prevents them from suckling. And you also want to minimize these other stressors such as vaccinations and things like that. So you either want to do them, it's recommended for vaccinations to do them a few weeks before weaning, so then it has time for the immunity to take effect, or waiting to move them after a couple weeks. Usually for the fence line nose clips, usually about a week of this contact, and then they kind of calm down, and then you can move them to another place. Then for all animals, whether they're just weaned or then having yearly boosters, some of the most common vaccinations are the clostridial vaccinations, which prevents against diseases caused by the Clostridium group of bacteria. And so these are things like tetanus, something called blackleg, which is caused by the bacteria and can cause problems with lameness, where it's like affecting the muscles of the leg. And it's also really important to protect cattle against respiratory diseases as well as abortion-causing diseases. And in most cases for these, you're really only going to need to get 2 vaccines because they have all of these different, they protect against all of these different diseases just in the one shot. And so that's a lot simpler. And if you're doing a group, here is a multi-dose syringe that can often be used. So then that means you only have to run them through one time. Usually, always make sure you read the labels because they'll tell you what you need to do. Usually, first time getting them, it's you get the vaccine and the booster, and then just an annual booster every year. And so these are the main ones. Obviously, you want to still talk to your veterinarian though to see if they recommend any others, if there are any diseases that are more prevalent in this area. Maybe you want to try, maybe you're having pink eye problems, so you want to try the pink eye vaccine as well. But when you're giving vaccines, it's really important to give them in the proper place. And typically, we want to think about this because eventually these beef animals will be going to produce beef, and if you're giving shots in areas with higher quality cuts, or you're not giving them properly, then that can cause damage to the meat, which is the end product. So generally, we recommend giving them in the neck. Intramuscular vaccine is like directly into the muscle, so you're going into the animal at a 90-degree angle. And then subcutaneous is just under the skin, so you're going at more of a 45-degree angle and not actually going into the muscle. So the ideal area here is on the neck, so in front of the shoulder and below the ligaments, and avoiding the spine and the jugular there. You also want to think about parasite control. This is so doing like deworming, and there's a lot of different ways that you can deworming. There's this pour-on, so you just put it on the back and it's absorbed through the skin. There's a kind that you can feed, as well as this is what's called a drench, which is a liquid that's given orally. So here's kind of the pour-on applicator. And the one thing to be really aware of with these is they're based on weight of the animal. So if you don't have a scale, you want to try and estimate what the weight is, but it's more important to give them a little more than they need. It's better to do that than give them less than they need, because if you're giving them less, you might not be taking care of all the parasites, and then that can contribute to parasite resistance of the dewormers. And then there are also kinds that are injectable, so you could give those when you're giving your vaccinations and things like that. And then also when we're talking about like external pests. Fly control is super important because flies obviously can carry a lot of diseases. They also will bite and affect the animals like that. The biggest disease we think of with flies is pink eye, because they can carry that from animal to animal. And so here are a couple different methods for fly control. Here, these are tags that have the insecticide in them. And so if you're using these, you want to make sure that you're wearing gloves, because you just don't want that absorbed into you, but it's safe for the cattle. And so this will keep flies away from them, as well as these have fly dust in them. So when the cattle, you want to put those in high traffic areas. So when the cattle are walking through, they get dusted, and that will help keep the flies away from them. Or here's another way of doing that. They have the mineral feeder. So every time the cow goes in the mineral feeder, they're going through where they have this fly dust in there. And then there are also fly controls that can be fed. So it's so much, it kind of bypasses through the animal and is more important for putting the insecticide kind of in the manure. So if a fly lands on it and lays eggs, then the larvae aren't gonna hatch. It's gonna help prevent having more flies on your property and in your herd. And so for all these things, it's super important to have a relationship with your veterinarian, because they can give you health recommendations, as well as, when they know you and they know your animals, and they are able to make better recommendations for your specific situations and work with you more closely to kind of keep your herd health in a good place. And then the last thing, I'm not going to talk a ton about this because we do have sessions in the future about auctions, as well as meat regulations and things. But when you're thinking about if you're getting into beef cattle and how you want to do this, you want to think about what kind of market are you looking for. Are you wanting to wean the calves and then sell them then? Do you want to keep them a little longer? Do you want to finish them and then sell market weight steers, or are you trying to market your meat locally? And so having to go find a slaughter facility and then either retail or do wholesaler, things like that. And additionally, we do have this beef quality assurance program is a national program that's implemented by the states. And so it is a completely voluntary training program that is designed to improve beef quality and also utilize more humane and sustainable practices in the beef industry. And so it's a certification that you can go through the training for. In New York, we do that. A lot of the trainers are with the cooperative extension in different counties. And going over topics like safe cattle handling, that's low stress and humane, properly using needles, making sure you're reading labels for medications, keeping good records to be able to produce the highest quality product for beef for the consumers. And also being able to improve the animal welfare and reduce the incidence of bruising or any kind of abscesses from improper needle use in the beef industry. So does anyone have any questions?
Grace, I have a quick question. You mentioned, having your own bull or artificial insemination. What about leasing a bull for producers in our area?
I mean, like a semen tank?
Like using your neighbor's bull, for example, instead.
Oh, yeah. That's definitely a thing that a lot of people do, and that's totally fine. You just want to make sure that your breeding seasons aren't the exact same. Where you have it staggered, so you're not both wanting to use it at the same time. There are sexually transmitted diseases that can happen in cattle. So there's another thing that's important with like breeding status exams and getting the bull checked out. So keeping that in mind. But that's definitely a viable option. You kind of split the costs of keeping the bull, or if you're just renting or leasing, then you don't have to worry about keeping them outside of that or anything like that. And it can definitely be a viable option for sure.
Hey, Grace. If I'm leasing a bull and they give me a breeding sound exam, should I also get registration papers to make sure it's genetics or what they say it are or say they are?
Well, I think that probably depends on how much you trust the person you're leasing it from. I haven't heard of people doing things like that. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, I guess. So, I mean, if they're purebred bull, they should have registration papers, or they might have registration papers. If not, it just really depends on, I guess, what your goals are. Are you really, if you have a purebred herd, does that matter? A lot of commercial producers, they might get purebred bulls, but they also might not, and it just depends on kind of what your goals are.
Kim asked in the chat, very good info. Are prior classes available to view or access?
Oh, yes, we have sent them out before. I don't know if maybe you hadn't registered by then, but we can definitely, Steph, I think we need to maybe find a way that we can just go to a website and find them, and that might be easier. But
yeah,
yes, we can definitely get those to you for sure.
Yeah. We'll send out the recordings for the past 4 weeks to everyone currently registered. And yeah, great idea. Let's get that posted somewhere too. Thanks. What other questions are out there? I had one more. As our beginner livestock farmers get to the point where maybe they're thinking about selling meat locally, if that's their goal, where can they look to find a slaughter facility near them?
So right now the Livestock Program Work Team website has a map of all the places in New York. So that doesn't necessarily cover, like here in the Hudson Valley, we obviously are close to other states. So it doesn't cover those, but it does list all of the, whether it's USDA inspected or custom exempt and other facilities like that. And that's a pretty easy tool to use as well.
Great, thank you.
Are there any more questions or?
Great. Well, hearing none, thank you everyone for attending week 4 of our Beginner Livestock series, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks to talk about meat science and regulations. We'll have 2 guest speakers, one from New York State's Ag and Markets and one from the United States Department of Agriculture. Thanks for joining us.